It's the year 1261, and in a small Byzantine town called Nymphium, a group of Genoese negotiators are signing a treaty that will grant them something extraordinary: trading privileges throughout the entire Byzantine Empire, tax exemptions that their Venetian rivals can only dream of, and most importantly, exclusive access to the Black Sea. This single document would transform a modest Italian port city into a global trading empire that stretched from the Atlantic shores of Africa to the distant markets of Central Asia. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. These Genoese merchants weren't just lucky. They were calculated risk-takers who understood something that most of their contemporaries missed entirely. While other traders played it safe with familiar routes and established partnerships, the Genoese looked at every crisis as an opportunity, every war as a chance to gain new advantages, and every seemingly impossible venture as their next great fortune. Before we start, consider subscribing to the channel. Now close your eyes and let us transport you to an age when fortune and disaster were separated by a single storm at sea, when a merchant's word was worth more than gold, and when the greatest risks yielded the most extraordinary rewards. Chapter 1: Genoa's Rise. The morning mist clings to the Ligurian coastline as we begin our tale in the year 1100. Genoa at this time was nothing more than a collection of stone houses huddled around a natural harbor, home to perhaps 30,000 souls who made their living from fishing and small-scale trading along the Italian coast. Yet within these humble origins lay the seeds of something extraordinary. To understand the magnitude of the Genoese transformation, imagine if a modern small coastal town suddenly became the financial capital of the world within a single generation. This is precisely what happened to Genoa during the 12th and 13th centuries, but the story begins even earlier, in the most unlikely of circumstances. The catalyst for Genoa's rise came not from careful planning or abundant natural resources, but from what modern historians call organized piracy. In the late 11th century, Genoese sailors discovered they possessed a remarkable talent for maritime warfare. Picture the scene in 1087, when a Genoese fleet sailed south to attack the stronghold of Mahdia in Tunisia. This was no desperate defensive action, but a carefully planned offensive expedition designed to capture treasure and establish trade relationships through force. The success of this raid revealed something crucial about the Genoese character. They were willing to take enormous risks for potentially enormous rewards, a philosophy that would guide their commercial empire for the next 4 centuries. The transformation from raiders to merchants happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Genoese captains who had once seized cargo by force began to realize that peaceful trade could be more profitable and sustainable than constant warfare. This evolution coincided perfectly with the launching of the First Crusade in 1096, which presented the Genoese with their first truly global opportunity. Genoese understood that armies needed transportation, supplies, and financing. More importantly, they recognized that successful crusades would create new trade routes to the east, potentially bypassing the traditional paths through Constantinople and Egypt that were controlled by their rivals. The Genoese commitment to the Crusades was total and calculating. They provided ships to transport knights and pilgrims, but they demanded something in return that would prove far more valuable than immediate payment. In city after city that the Crusaders captured, the Genoese negotiated for permanent trading quarters, tax exemptions, and judicial autonomy. By 1104, they had secured privileged positions in Jaffa, Arsuf, Caesarea, and most importantly, the great port of Acre. These trading stations represented something entirely new in medieval commerce. Unlike traditional merchants who arrived in foreign ports as supplicants, the Genoese established themselves as permanent residents with legal rights and economic privileges. They built warehouses, churches, and even small fortifications. In essence, they created the first commercial colonies in recorded history. The success in the Crusader states revealed the genius of the Genoese approach to international trade. Rather than simply buying and selling goods, they created comprehensive networks of relationships, legal protections, and physical infrastructure. A Genoese merchant traveling from Italy to Syria in 1150 could expect to find fellow citizens, familiar laws, and secure facilities at every major port along the route. This systematic approach to trade expansion required unprecedented levels of organization and cooperation among Genoese merchants. In response to these needs, they developed one of the most sophisticated commercial legal systems of the medieval period. The surviving records of Giovanni Scriba, a Genoese notary from the mid-12th century, reveal the complexity and innovation of their business practices. Scriba's cartulary contains over 1,300 commercial contracts from the years 1154 to 1164, providing us with an extraordinary window into the daily operations of medieval international trade. These documents reveal that the Genoese had developed three primary forms of commercial partnership, each designed to manage risk in different circumstances. The societas, which represented about 80% of Scriba's contracts, was a bilateral partnership where both the traveling merchant and the investor contributed capital. The traveling partner provided 1/3 of the total investment, while the sedentary investor contributed 2/3. Upon successful completion of the voyage, profits were divided equally between the partners. This arrangement ensured that both parties had significant financial incentives for the venture's success. The commenda, which became increasingly popular after 1164, was a unilateral partnership where only the investor provided capital. The traveling merchant contributed his labor, expertise, and willingness to face the dangers of long-distance travel. Profits were typically divided, with the investor receiving 3/4 and the merchant receiving 1/4. This arrangement allowed merchants with limited capital to participate in lucrative long-distance trade. The third form, the sea loan, was perhaps the most innovative. This was essentially maritime insurance disguised as a high-interest loan. The lender provided money for a trading voyage with the understanding that if the ship was lost at sea, the loan would be forgiven. If the voyage succeeded, the merchant repaid the principal plus a substantial premium. This system allowed merchants to transfer the financial risk of maritime disasters to investors who were willing to accept that risk in exchange for potentially high returns. These financial innovations were not merely abstract legal arrangements. They represented practical solutions to the enormous risks inherent in medieval long-distance trade. Consider the challenges facing a Genoese merchant planning a voyage to Syria in 1160. The journey would take several months each direction. Pirates, storms, political upheavals, and disease could destroy the entire investment at any moment. And traditional banking institutions did not exist to provide loans or insurance. Without the societas, commenda, and sea loan arrangements, such voyages would have been impossible for most merchants. The mathematical precision of these risk-sharing arrangements reveals the sophisticated understanding of probability that Genoese merchants had developed through practical experience. They understood that while individual voyages might fail catastrophically, a portfolio of multiple ventures would likely generate profits sufficient to compensate for occasional losses. By 1200, the Genoese commercial network extended far beyond the Crusader states. Their merchants could be found in every major port of the Mediterranean, from Barcelona to Alexandria, from Tunis to Trebizond. They had established permanent trading colonies in Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Most remarkably, they had begun to challenge Venetian dominance in the wealthy markets of Constantinople and the Black Sea. The scale of Genoese commercial operations in this period is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. Individual merchants routinely invested sums equivalent to millions of modern dollars in single voyages. The total volume of trade handled by Genoese merchants in the 13th century probably exceeded the gross domestic product of most European kingdoms. This explosive commercial growth created unprecedented wealth in Genoa itself. By 1250, the city had grown to perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. Magnificent palaces rose along the harbor front, constructed by merchant families whose names would dominate Genoese politics for centuries. The Doria, Spinola, Fieschi, and Grimaldi families built stone towers and fortified compounds that still stand today as testaments to their medieval wealth. The physical transformation of Genoa during this period reflected deeper changes in European society. The city became a laboratory for new forms of social organization based on commercial rather than feudal relationships. Unlike the agricultural economy that dominated most of Europe, Genoa developed an urban economy where success depended on intelligence, courage, and business acumen rather than noble birth or control of land. The Genoese commune, established in the early 12th century, represented one of the first experiments in republican government since ancient Rome. Executive power was shared among annually elected consuls chosen from the leading merchant families. This system ensured that political decisions reflected the interests of the commercial community rather than feudal lords or ecclesiastical authorities. The success of this merchant republic attracted attention throughout Europe. Kings and emperors began to recognize that Genoese financial resources could be more valuable than traditional military alliances. By 1200, Genoese bankers were lending money to the kings of France, England, and Castile. They had become indispensable participants in the international politics of medieval Europe. Yet this golden age of Genoese expansion was built on foundations that contained the seeds of future challenges. The wealth that flowed into Genoa created intense competition among merchant families for political control. The Ghibelline and Guelph factions, representing different approaches to relations with the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy, engaged in increasingly bitter conflicts that would eventually weaken the Republic's unity. More ominously, the success of Genoese merchants had created a formidable rival. Venice, which had initially focused on trade with Byzantium and the eastern Mediterranean, began to compete directly with Genoa for control of the most lucrative commercial routes. This rivalry would explode into a series of devastating wars that would test the limits of Genoese courage and financial resources. As the 13th century progressed, the stakes of international commerce continued to escalate. The profits available to successful merchants were enormous, but so were the risks. A single miscalculation could bankrupt even the wealthiest families. The next phase of Genoese history would be defined by ventures so audacious that they would either secure the Republic's position as the dominant commercial power of the medieval world or destroy it entirely. The stage was set for the greatest gambles in the history of medieval commerce. In the shadows of their stone palaces, Genoese merchants were planning expeditions that would take them to the ends of the earth, financial innovations that would revolutionize European banking, and political alliances that would reshape the balance of power from Spain to the Black Sea. But first, they would have to survive the coming storm of war with Venice, a conflict that would prove whether their carefully constructed commercial empire could withstand the ultimate test of military and economic competition with an equally determined rival. The greatest risks were yet to come. Chapter 2: High-Risk Ventures. The winter of 1261 found the most daring Genoese merchants gathered in the stone halls of their family palaces, plotting what historians would later recognize as one of the most audacious commercial gambles of the medieval period. Outside, storms lashed the Ligurian coast, but inside these chambers, men were planning ventures that would make the fury of nature seem tame by comparison. The opportunity that captured their imagination lay 1,500 miles to the east, beyond the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean and the narrow straits that guarded the Black Sea. For decades, this inland ocean had been effectively closed to Western European merchants, controlled by their bitter rivals from Venice under privileges granted by the Byzantine Empire. But whispers carried by Syrian traders spoke of unimaginable wealth waiting in the ports of Crimea and the distant reaches of the Don River. To understand the magnitude of what the Genoese were contemplating, imagine modern entrepreneurs planning to establish trading colonies on Mars. The Black Sea in 1261 was almost equally remote and dangerous from the Genoese perspective. The journey required navigating through politically unstable territories, dealing with unfamiliar cultures, and establishing permanent settlements in lands where no Western European had ever attempted commercial operations on a significant scale. The catalyst for this extraordinary venture came through the most unlikely of political alliances. Michael VIII Palaiologos, the ambitious emperor of Nicaea, who dreamed of recapturing Constantinople from the Latin Empire, approached Genoa with a proposition that seemed almost too good to be true. In exchange for Genoese naval support in his planned assault on Constantinople, he offered them unprecedented trading privileges throughout the restored Byzantine Empire, including access to the legendary wealth of the Black Sea. The Treaty of Nymphium, signed in March 1261, represented a masterpiece of calculated risk-taking. The Genoese committed their naval forces to what many observers considered a hopeless cause. The Latin Empire, though weakened, still possessed formidable defenses and the backing of Venice. Michael's forces were untested against such powerful opponents. Yet if the gamble succeeded, Genoa would gain access to trading opportunities that could dwarf their existing commercial empire. The mathematical audacity of this commitment becomes clear when we consider the resources involved. The Genoese fleet that sailed east in the summer of 1261 represented the largest single investment in their history. Over 60 ships, carrying more than 10,000 sailors and marines, departed from Genoa's harbor. The cost of this expedition, in modern terms, would have exceeded $100 million. But the Genoese understood something that their more cautious competitors missed. The potential rewards were so enormous that even a small probability of success justified the enormous risks. The Black Sea region produced grain that could feed the growing cities of Western Europe, furs that commanded premium prices in Mediterranean markets, and slaves whose sale could generate profits of several 100%. On July 25, 1261, the incredible happened. Michael's forces, supported by the Genoese fleet, succeeded in recapturing Constantinople in a surprise attack that stunned the medieval world. The Latin Empire collapsed, the Byzantine Empire was restored, and suddenly the Genoese found themselves in possession of trading privileges that made them the dominant Western European commercial power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The immediate aftermath of this success reveals the sophisticated planning that lay behind the Genoese gamble. Rather than celebrating their good fortune, Genoese merchants immediately began implementing a comprehensive strategy for exploiting their new opportunities. Within months of the fall of Constantinople, they had established a fortified trading quarter in Pira, across the Golden Horn from the Byzantine capital. Pira rapidly became the nerve center of Genoese operations in the east. Unlike traditional trading posts, which were merely temporary facilities for loading and unloading cargo, Pira was designed as a permanent commercial city. The Genoese constructed warehouses, residential quarters, churches, and administrative buildings. They established their own courts, collected their own taxes, and maintained their own military garrison. The creation of Pira represented a fundamental innovation in medieval commerce. The Genoese had essentially created an extraterritorial colony within the Byzantine Empire, subject to Genoese rather than Byzantine law. This arrangement provided the legal security and administrative efficiency that large-scale commerce required, while allowing them to operate in foreign markets without the usual constraints imposed by local authorities. From Pira, Genoese merchants began to probe the possibilities of Black Sea trade with the systematic thoroughness that characterized their approach to new opportunities. Initial reconnaissance voyages revealed the existence of established trading networks connecting the Black Sea ports with the Asian caravan routes. More importantly, they discovered that the political fragmentation of the region created opportunities for multiple competing commercial arrangements. The establishment of their first major Black Sea colony at Kaffa in Crimea represented another enormous calculated risk. The site was located over 300 miles from Constantinople, in territories controlled by the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that dominated the western steppes. Negotiating commercial agreements with Mongol rulers required diplomatic skills that few European merchants possessed. Yet the Genoese approached these negotiations with the same mathematical precision they brought to their financial arrangements. They understood that the Mongols, despite their fearsome military reputation, were fundamentally pragmatic in their approach to trade. The Golden Horde derived substantial revenues from customs duties and tribute payments. A successful European trading colony would benefit Mongol finances as well as Genoese profits. The construction of Kaffa began in the 1260s and continued for several decades. The Genoese built not merely a trading post, but a fortified city complete with massive stone walls, towers, and a protected harbor. The scale of this undertaking can be appreciated by considering that the walls of Kaffa, when completed, enclosed an area larger than many European capitals. The defensive preparations at Kaffa reflected the inherent dangers of Black Sea commerce. The region was politically unstable, with frequent conflicts between various Mongol factions, Byzantine successor states, and emerging Ottoman power. Pirates operated freely in the Black Sea, preying on merchant vessels. Natural disasters, including earthquakes and devastating storms, posed constant threats to both shipping and shore installations. Despite these dangers, or perhaps because of them, the profits available from Black Sea trade were extraordinary. Grain purchased in Kaffa for 6 gold pieces could be sold in Constantinople for 20, yielding profits of over 300% before accounting for transportation costs. Furs obtained from Russian trappers commanded even higher premiums in Western European markets, with some varieties selling for 10 times their purchase price. The slave trade, though morally abhorrent by modern standards, represented perhaps the most lucrative aspect of Black Sea commerce. The constant warfare among the various ethnic and religious groups of the region provided a steady supply of captives who could be purchased cheaply and sold at enormous profits in Mediterranean markets. Genoese merchants developed sophisticated networks for transporting and marketing slaves throughout their commercial empire. The mathematical precision with which the Genoese calculated the profitability of slave trading reveals the cold commercial logic that drove their expansion. Detailed records from Kaffa indicate that slaves could be purchased for an average of 12 gold pieces and sold in Mediterranean markets for 60 to 80 gold pieces. Even accounting for transportation costs, insurance, and mortality during transport, slave trading generated profits of over 400%. The scale of Genoese slave trading operations was enormous. Conservative estimates suggest that Kaffa alone exported over 10,000 slaves annually during the peak years of the 14th century. The total number of individuals enslaved through Genoese operations probably exceeded 500,000 over the course of 2 centuries. The wealth generated by Black Sea operations transformed Genoa itself. The great merchant families used their profits to construct increasingly elaborate palaces and to compete for political influence within the Republic. The Doria family, which had played a leading role in the conquest of Constantinople, became so wealthy that they could afford to maintain private fleets rivaling those of many European kingdoms. Yet success in the Black Sea also created new vulnerabilities. The Genoese commercial empire was now stretched across thousands of miles, from Spain to Crimea. Defending this vast network required unprecedented coordination and enormous financial resources. A single military defeat or political miscalculation could jeopardize the entire system. More ominously, the success of Genoese expansion had intensified their rivalry with Venice to the point where armed conflict seemed inevitable. The Venetians watched with growing alarm as Genoese merchants established dominant positions in markets that Venice had previously considered its exclusive domain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether the Genoese commercial system could survive military challenges from an equally determined and well-funded opponent. The Genoese approach to managing these escalating tensions revealed the same calculated risk-taking that had characterized their expansion into the Black Sea. Rather than seeking diplomatic compromises that might preserve peace but limit their commercial opportunities, they chose to prepare for total war. The logic was brutally simple. Either they would destroy Venetian competition permanently, or Venice would destroy them. The preparations for this coming conflict required financial resources on a scale that dwarfed even their previous investments. Ships had to be constructed, armies recruited, and alliances negotiated with various European powers. The costs were staggering, but the Genoese calculated that the alternative, accepting a subordinate position to Venice in Mediterranean commerce, was economically unacceptable. As the 13th century drew to a close, Genoese merchants found themselves committed to a strategy of expansion that offered no middle ground between total success and catastrophic failure. Their Black Sea colonies were generating enormous profits, but defending those profits would require them to wage war against the most formidable maritime power in the Mediterranean. The next phase of their story would determine whether their appetite for calculated risks would secure their position as the dominant commercial power of the medieval world, or whether they had finally gambled beyond their means. The stakes could not have been higher, and the outcome would reshape the balance of power throughout the medieval Mediterranean. In the luxurious chambers of their Genoese palaces, merchants continued their careful calculations, weighing probabilities and potential returns with the same mathematical precision that had guided their expansion. But now the variables in their equations included not just commercial opportunities, but the possibility of total military defeat and the complete destruction of everything they had built. The greatest test of Genoese courage and calculation was about to begin. Chapter 3: Banking Innovations. The flickering candlelight in the stone chambers of medieval Genoa illuminated more than just the faces of merchants counting gold coins. In the early 14th century, these rooms witnessed the birth of financial innovations that would reshape the global economy for centuries to come. What emerged from the creative minds of Genoese bankers was nothing less than the foundation of modern capitalism, born from necessity and refined through the harsh realities of international commerce. To appreciate the revolutionary nature of these innovations, we must first understand the primitive state of European finance before the Genoese transformed it. In the year 1300, most of Europe operated on what we would consider a barter economy with limited monetary systems. Kings stored their wealth in the form of gold and silver objects locked in castle vaults. Merchants who needed to transport large sums faced the constant threat of robbery, while those seeking loans had few options beyond local moneylenders who charged usurious interest rates. The catalyst for Genoese financial innovation came from the practical challenges of managing their far-flung commercial empire. A merchant in Genoa who needed to pay for goods in Caffa faced seemingly insurmountable logistical problems. Transporting gold coins across 1,500 miles of dangerous territory was extremely expensive and risky. Converting currencies at each stage of the journey involved substantial costs and exposure to fraud. The existing banking systems simply could not handle the volume and complexity of transactions that Genoese commerce required. The solution that emerged was the bill of exchange, a financial instrument so sophisticated that modern bankers would find it familiar. The basic concept was elegantly simple. A Genoese merchant could deposit money with a banker in Genoa and receive a written document authorizing him to collect an equivalent sum in local currency from the banker's correspondent in a distant city. This eliminated the need to transport actual coins while providing a secure method for international payments. However, the practical implementation of the bill of exchange system required innovations that went far beyond its basic concept. Genoese bankers developed standardized procedures for currency conversion, detailed legal frameworks for resolving disputes, and communication networks that could coordinate transactions across thousands of miles. The mathematical sophistication involved in calculating exchange rates, interest charges, and risk premiums was unprecedented in medieval Europe. The genius of the Genoese approach lay in their understanding that bills of exchange could serve multiple functions simultaneously. A single document could facilitate payment, provide credit, offer insurance against currency fluctuations, and generate profit for the banking intermediaries. This multifunctional approach maximized the utility of each transaction while minimizing the administrative costs involved. The scale on which Genoese bankers operated the bill of exchange system was extraordinary. By 1350, a single major banking house might be processing hundreds of transactions simultaneously, involving dozens of different currencies and commercial centers spanning from London to Constantinople. The coordination required to manage such operations demanded organizational skills that surpassed those of most European governments. The success of the bill of exchange system encouraged Genoese bankers to develop even more sophisticated financial instruments. The sea loan, which had existed in primitive forms since ancient times, was refined into a comprehensive maritime insurance system. Under these arrangements, merchants could transfer virtually all the financial risks of long-distance trade to specialized investors who understood the mathematical relationships between risk and reward. The calculation of sea loan premiums reveals the remarkable statistical sophistication that Genoese bankers had developed through practical experience. They maintained detailed records of shipping losses, seasonal variations in storm activity, political instabilities that affected trade routes, and numerous other factors that influenced the probability of successful voyages. These data were used to calculate risk premiums with precision that would not be surpassed until the development of modern actuarial science. But the most revolutionary innovation of Genoese finance was yet to come. The continuous warfare with Venice and other rivals had created enormous demands for military financing that exceeded the resources of individual merchants or even wealthy families. The traditional solution, borrowing money at high interest rates from private lenders, was inadequate for the scale of expenditures required to maintain Genoa's commercial empire. The Genoese response to this challenge was the creation of the Cassa di San Giorgio in 1407, an institution that modern financial historians consider the world's first true central bank. The Cassa combined the functions of debt management, commercial banking, deposit-taking, and even colonial administration in ways that prefigured the financial institutions of the modern era. The founding of the Cassa di San Giorgio represented a response to a financial crisis that had brought Genoa to the brink of bankruptcy. The War of Chioggia against Venice had ended in 1381 with a Genoese defeat that left the Republic owing enormous sums to its creditors. Traditional approaches to debt management were clearly inadequate for handling obligations of this magnitude. The solution devised by Genoese financiers was breathtakingly innovative. Rather than attempting to repay the debt directly, they consolidated all government obligations into a single institution and gave that institution the authority to collect specific taxes to service the debt. Creditors received shares in the Cassa di San Giorgio that entitled them to receive payments from designated tax revenues. This arrangement created what was essentially the first modern bond market. The shares in the Cassa di San Giorgio could be bought and sold freely, allowing investors to adjust their portfolios according to their individual needs for liquidity or income. The prices of these shares fluctuated according to market conditions, creating opportunities for speculation and investment that had never existed before. The mathematical sophistication involved in structuring the Cassa di San Giorgio was extraordinary. The institution's founders had to calculate the present value of future tax revenues, estimate the appropriate interest rates for different classes of debt, and design mechanisms for adjusting payments according to changing economic conditions. The complexity of these calculations required accounting methods that were centuries ahead of their time. More remarkably, the Cassa di San Giorgio was authorized to engage in commercial banking operations alongside its debt management functions. The institution accepted deposits from private individuals, extended loans to merchants, and facilitated international payments through its network of correspondents. This combination of public and private banking functions created synergies that enhanced the efficiency of both activities. The deposit banking operations of the Cassa di San Giorgio represented another fundamental innovation. For the first time in European history, individuals could deposit money in a secure institution and receive written receipts that functioned as negotiable instruments. These receipts could be endorsed and transferred to third parties, creating what was essentially the first paper money system in medieval Europe. The security measures implemented by the Cassa di San Giorgio were unprecedented in their sophistication. The institution maintained multiple sets of accounting records, required dual signatures for large transactions, and established elaborate procedures for verifying the authenticity of financial documents. These safeguards created a level of confidence in paper instruments that had never existed before. The success of the Cassa di San Giorgio's deposit banking operations had profound implications for the broader Genoese economy. The availability of secure deposit facilities encouraged saving and capital accumulation. The ability to make payments through bank transfers reduced transaction costs and facilitated commerce. Most importantly, the concentration of financial resources in a single institution created opportunities for large-scale lending that would have been impossible under previous arrangements. The lending operations of the Cassa di San Giorgio extended far beyond the boundaries of Genoa itself. The institution provided loans to European monarchs, including substantial advances to the Spanish crown that helped finance the early phases of American exploration. Christopher Columbus himself maintained accounts with the Cassa di San Giorgio and corresponded regularly with its directors about financial matters. The international scope of the Casa di San Giorgio's operations required the development of sophisticated risk management techniques. The institution maintained detailed assessments of the creditworthiness of various borrowers, monitored political developments that might affect loan repayments, and diversified its lending portfolio across multiple countries and currencies. These risk management practices were centuries ahead of their time. The profitability of the Casa di San Giorgio's operations was extraordinary. During the 15th and 16th centuries, the institution generated returns that consistently exceeded 20% annually. These profits were distributed to shareholders in the form of regular dividend payments, creating what was essentially the first modern investment fund. The administrative complexity of managing the Casa di San Giorgio's diverse operations required organizational innovations that influenced the development of corporate management throughout Europe. The institution developed formal procedures for internal auditing, systematic approaches to personnel training, and standardized methods for financial reporting. These management techniques were studied and imitated by commercial organizations throughout the continent. Perhaps most remarkably, the Casa di San Giorgio was granted direct administrative control over several of Genoa's overseas territories. The institution governed Corsica, Gazaria, and other possessions as commercial enterprises, collecting taxes, maintaining military forces, and conducting diplomatic relations. This combination of banking and governmental functions created a unique form of corporate colonialism that prefigured the trading companies of later centuries. The success of Genoa's financial innovations had profound implications that extended far beyond their immediate commercial advantages. The techniques developed in Genoa were studied and adapted by bankers throughout Europe. The Medici banks of Florence, the Fugger operations in Germany, and even the early central banks of Northern Europe all incorporated elements that originated in Genoese financial houses. Yet the very success of these innovations also created new vulnerabilities. The Casa di San Giorgio's operations were so extensive and complex that managing them required unprecedented levels of coordination and oversight. A single major miscalculation could jeopardize not just the institution itself, but the entire Genoese economy that had become dependent on its services. Moreover, the financial sophistication that gave Genoa competitive advantages also made the Republic increasingly dependent on the smooth functioning of international markets. Political disruptions, currency crises, or military conflicts could disrupt the delicate network of relationships that supported Genoese banking operations. The interconnectedness that created profits also amplified risks. As the 15th century progressed, these systemic risks would become increasingly apparent. The rise of Ottoman power was beginning to disrupt traditional trade routes. The discovery of new sea routes to Asia threatened the Mediterranean commerce that supported Genoese banking. Most ominously, the emergence of new financial centers in Northern Europe was creating competition that challenged Genoa's dominance in international banking. The stage was set for a confrontation between the innovative financial techniques that had made Genoa wealthy and the changing geopolitical realities that threatened to make those techniques obsolete. The next chapter of Genoese history would test whether financial innovation alone could sustain a commercial empire in the face of fundamental shifts in the global balance of power. In the quiet offices of the Casa di San Giorgio, clerks continued their careful calculations, processing the thousands of transactions that kept the Genoese financial system functioning. But outside those walls, larger forces were gathering that would soon challenge everything the Genoese had built through centuries of calculated risk and brilliant innovation. Chapter 4: Rivalries with Venice. The Mediterranean dawn of 1294 cast long shadows across the harbor of Acre as two fleets faced each other in what would become one of the most consequential naval confrontations of the medieval period. On one side, the Red Cross banners of Venice fluttered above ships laden with the wealth of Byzantine trade. On the other, the distinctive red and white stripes of Genoa marked vessels carrying the profits of Black Sea commerce. Between these two maritime powers lay not just the immediate prize of control over the Levanten markets, but the ultimate question of which Italian republic would dominate Mediterranean trade for generations to come. To understand the intensity of the Venetian-Genoese rivalry, imagine two modern corporations competing not just for market share, but for the right to exist. This was total economic warfare conducted with the same ruthless determination that characterized military campaigns between nation-states. The stakes were nothing less than commercial supremacy over the entire Mediterranean world, and both sides understood that compromise meant eventual extinction. The origins of this rivalry stretched back over 2 centuries, rooted in the fundamental differences between Venetian and Genoese approaches to international commerce. Venice had built its empire through careful diplomacy and exclusive trading agreements, particularly with the Byzantine Empire. The Venetians preferred monopolistic arrangements that guaranteed them privileged access to specific markets in exchange for political and military support. Genoa, by contrast, had developed a more aggressive and opportunistic strategy. Rather than relying on diplomatic privileges, the Genoese established their own commercial infrastructure wherever they could gain access. They built fortified trading posts, negotiated with multiple competing authorities, and were willing to use military force to protect their commercial interests. This fundamental difference in approach made conflict inevitable. The mathematical scale of what was at stake becomes clear when we examine the volume of trade controlled by each republic during the 13th century. Venice's privileged position in Constantinople and the Eastern Mediterranean generated annual revenues equivalent to perhaps 50 million modern dollars. Genoa's more diversified but equally extensive network, stretching from Spain to Crimea, probably produced similar returns. The total prize represented the wealth of nations. The immediate catalyst for the First Venetian-Genoese War was a dispute over trading privileges in Acre that perfectly exemplified the underlying tensions between the two systems. The Venetians claimed exclusive rights to certain sections of the city based on agreements with the Crusader authorities. The Genoese argued that their contributions to the conquest of Acre entitled them to equal treatment. When negotiations failed, both sides resorted to violence. The attack on the Venetian quarter of Acre in 1256 marked the beginning of a conflict that would span over a century. But this was not merely a local disturbance. Both Venice and Genoa understood that the outcome in Acre would establish precedents that would affect their competition throughout the Mediterranean. They committed resources to this confrontation on a scale that amazed contemporary observers. The Genoese fleet that sailed to Acre included over 60 vessels carrying more than 6,000 men. This represented a larger military force than many European kingdoms could mobilize. The costs of maintaining such an expedition were staggering, but the Genoese calculated that the alternative, allowing Venice to establish unchallenged dominance in the Levant, was economically unacceptable. The Venetian response was equally massive. Within months of the Genoese attack, a Venetian fleet under Lorenzo Tiepolo was sailing eastward with instructions to destroy Genoese commercial operations not just in Acre, but throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians had decided that half measures were insufficient. They needed to eliminate Genoese competition entirely. The naval battle that ensued near Acre in 1258 demonstrated the technological sophistication that both republics had developed in their commercial competition. The ships involved were not merely merchant vessels pressed into military service, but purpose-built warships designed specifically for Mediterranean combat. The largest vessels carried crews of over 200 men and were equipped with siege engines capable of attacking fortified positions. The Venetian victory in this initial engagement revealed the superior coordination and tactical discipline that Venice had developed through its long partnership with Byzantium. However, the Genoese response demonstrated the resilience that would characterize their approach to this extended conflict. Rather than accepting defeat, they immediately began preparing for a sustained campaign that would test the limits of both republics' resources. The economic warfare that accompanied the naval conflicts was perhaps even more devastating than the military campaigns themselves. Both sides used their commercial networks to attack their opponents' trade. Venetian merchants were excluded from Genoese-controlled ports, while Genoese traders found themselves barred from markets where Venice had influence. The result was a systematic attempt by each side to destroy the other's economic foundation. The innovation and adaptation that this commercial warfare required were extraordinary. Genoese merchants developed new trade routes that bypassed Venetian-controlled territories, while Venetian traders negotiated alternative arrangements that reduced their dependence on markets where Genoa had influence. Both sides invested heavily in intelligence networks that could provide advance warning of their opponents' activities. The Treaty of Nymphium in 1261 represented a brilliant Genoese counterstroke that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. By allying with Michael VIII Palaiologos and supporting the recapture of Constantinople, the Genoese gained access to the Byzantine Empire on terms that were actually more favorable than those the Venetians had previously enjoyed. The Venetian response to this setback revealed the depth of their commitment to maintaining Mediterranean dominance. Rather than accepting their reduced position in Byzantine markets, Venice began negotiating alliances with other European powers that could provide alternative sources of support. The conflict was escalating from a commercial dispute into a broader geopolitical confrontation. The Second Venetian-Genoese War, which erupted in 1291, demonstrated that neither side had learned to compromise. If anything, the stakes had increased during the intervening decades. Genoese expansion into the Black Sea had created new sources of wealth that Venice was determined to capture or destroy. Venetian development of alternative trade routes had reduced but not eliminated their dependence on eastern Mediterranean commerce. The scale of the second conflict dwarfed the first war. Both sides had used the peaceful interlude to develop larger fleets, more sophisticated weapons, and more extensive alliance systems. The naval battles of this period involved fleets of over 100 vessels, making them among the largest maritime engagements in medieval history. The Battle of Curzola in 1298 marked the climax of this Second War and demonstrated the ultimate futility of seeking decisive victory through military means alone. The Genoese achieved a stunning tactical victory, capturing or destroying much of the Venetian fleet and taking thousands of prisoners. Among the captured was Marco Polo, whose imprisonment in Genoa led to the composition of his famous account of travels in Asia. Yet even this overwhelming military success failed to achieve the strategic objectives that had motivated the war. Venice's commercial empire was wounded but not destroyed. Within a few years, Venetian merchants were again competing effectively with their Genoese rivals in markets throughout the Mediterranean. The enormous costs of the military campaigns had weakened both republics without resolving the fundamental competition between them. The Third War, which began in 1350, occurred in the context of broader European conflicts that complicated the bilateral rivalry between Venice and Genoa. Both republics found themselves drawn into alliances with various European powers, transforming their commercial competition into a component of larger geopolitical struggles. This escalation increased the resources available to both sides, but also multiplied the potential consequences of defeat. The sophistication of the military technology employed in these later conflicts reflected the enormous profits that Mediterranean commerce had generated for both republics. The ships used in the War of the Straits were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than any vessels that had previously sailed the Mediterranean. The cost of constructing and maintaining these fleets exceeded the military budgets of most European kingdoms. The climactic phase of the Venetian-Genoese rivalry came with the War of Chioggia, which began in 1377 and brought Venice closer to destruction than at any time in its history. The Genoese strategy in this conflict demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of economic warfare that they had developed through centuries of commercial competition. Rather than merely attacking Venetian shipping, they attempted to blockade Venice itself and starve the city into submission. The Siege of Chioggia represented the ultimate test of Venetian resilience. Cut off from their traditional trade routes and facing a Genoese fleet at the entrance to their lagoon, the Venetians were forced to mobilize every available resource for what amounted to a fight for national survival. The response they mounted revealed the extraordinary depths of wealth and determination that commercial success had created. The Venetian victory at Chioggia in 1380 marked the end of the great age of Venetian-Genoese warfare, but not because either side had achieved decisive dominance. Both republics had exhausted themselves through decades of conflict that had consumed enormous resources without resolving the fundamental competition between them. The emerging Ottoman power presented new challenges that required both Venice and Genoa to reassess their strategic priorities. The mathematical analysis of what the Venetian-Genoese wars had cost both republics is sobering. Conservative estimates suggest that each side spent the equivalent of hundreds of millions of modern dollars on military campaigns that ultimately proved inconclusive. These resources could have been used to develop new trade routes, construct additional commercial infrastructure, or invest in the technological innovations that were beginning to transform European commerce. Yet the wars also demonstrated the extraordinary wealth that Mediterranean trade had created, and the sophisticated financial systems that both republics had developed to mobilize that wealth for military purposes. The ability to sustain major naval campaigns for decades revealed organizational capabilities that exceeded those of most European monarchies. The long-term consequences of the Venetian-Genoese rivalry extended far beyond the immediate effects on the two republics involved. The centuries of conflict had accelerated the development of naval technology, commercial law, and financial institutions throughout the Mediterranean. The competitive pressure had forced both sides to achieve levels of efficiency and innovation that might never have emerged under more peaceful circumstances. More ominously, the mutual exhaustion that resulted from this extended conflict left both Venice and Genoa vulnerable to challenges from new competitors. The Ottoman Empire was beginning to assert control over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes that had been the foundation of Italian commercial prosperity. Portuguese and Spanish explorers were developing alternative routes to Asian markets that could bypass the Mediterranean entirely. As the 14th century drew to a close, the great age of Italian maritime dominance was facing challenges that neither Venice nor Genoa was adequately prepared to meet. The skills they had developed in fighting each other would prove inadequate for competing with the emerging global powers that were beginning to reshape international commerce. The final irony of the Venetian-Genoese rivalry was that both republics had succeeded so completely in weakening each other that neither was positioned to capitalize on the new opportunities that global exploration was creating. The mathematical precision with which they had calculated the costs and benefits of their mutual conflict had failed to account for the possibility that their entire commercial system could be made obsolete by technological and geographical developments beyond their control. In the quiet aftermath of centuries of warfare, merchants in both Venice and Genoa began to realize that their greatest enemy had not been each other, but their failure to anticipate the fundamental changes that were reshaping the global economy. The age of Mediterranean commercial dominance was ending, and neither republic had prepared adequately for the new world that was emerging. Chapter 5: Decline of Genoa. The year 1453 dawned with no particular sense of foreboding in the stone palaces of Genoa, where merchants continued their age-old rituals of calculating profits and planning voyages with the confidence born of centuries of commercial success. Yet by sunset on May 29 of that year, the sound of Ottoman cannons breaching the walls of Constantinople would echo across the Mediterranean with implications that would forever alter the foundations of Genoese prosperity. The fall of the Byzantine capital marked not just the end of an empire, but the beginning of the end for the commercial system that had made Genoa one of the wealthiest cities in the world. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, imagine a modern corporation discovering that the fundamental technology underlying its entire business model had suddenly become obsolete. This was precisely the situation facing Genoese merchants as Ottoman control of Constantinople threatened to disrupt trade routes that had generated enormous profits for over 2 centuries. The mathematical precision with which they had calculated risks and returns was suddenly confronted with variables that no amount of historical experience could predict. The immediate impact of the Ottoman conquest was not the total cessation of trade that many Genoese had feared, but something potentially more dangerous: the imposition of new terms that fundamentally altered the economics of Eastern Mediterranean commerce. The Ottomans, contrary to the expectations of European merchants, initially encouraged continued trade. However, they demanded tribute payments, imposed new customs duties, and established monopolies that significantly reduced the profit margins on traditional Genoese operations. The sophisticated cost-benefit analyses that had guided Genoese expansion for generations suddenly required complete recalculation. Routes that had been profitable under Byzantine rule became marginally viable under Ottoman taxation. Trading posts that had operated securely for decades found themselves subject to new regulations that could change without notice. The predictability that effective commercial planning required had been replaced by political uncertainties that made long-term investment extremely risky. The Genoese response to these challenges revealed both the strengths and limitations of their commercial culture. With characteristic adaptability, many merchants began exploring alternative opportunities that could compensate for their reduced Eastern Mediterranean profits. Some invested heavily in Atlantic exploration, hoping to discover new routes to Asian markets that could bypass Ottoman-controlled territories entirely. Others shifted their focus to European markets, where their financial expertise could generate returns despite the loss of traditional trading opportunities. However, the scale of the challenge exceeded even the considerable adaptive capabilities of individual Genoese merchants. The Eastern Mediterranean trade had not been merely one component of a diversified commercial portfolio, but the foundation upon which the entire Genoese financial system rested. The Cassa di San Giorgio, the innovative banking institution that had revolutionized medieval finance, found its operations increasingly strained as traditional sources of revenue declined. The mathematical complexity of managing this transition was extraordinary. The Cassa di San Giorgio faced the challenge of maintaining dividend payments to shareholders while simultaneously investing in new opportunities that might eventually replace lost Eastern Mediterranean profits. The institution's directors had to calculate not just the immediate costs of reduced trade revenues, but the long-term implications of fundamental changes in global commerce. The detailed records that survive from this period reveal the sophisticated financial analysis that Genoese bankers applied to their declining circumstances. They maintained precise accounts of revenue losses from specific trade routes, calculated the costs of establishing alternative commercial operations, and assessed the political risks associated with various investment options. The quality of this analysis was remarkable, but it could not overcome the fundamental reality that their traditional sources of wealth were disappearing. The gradual loss of Genoese colonies in the Black Sea provided a particularly painful demonstration of how quickly centuries of investment could become worthless. Kaffa, the great commercial center that had anchored Genoese operations in Crimea for over 200 years, fell to Ottoman forces in 1475. The warehouses, fortifications, and administrative infrastructure that represented generations of accumulated capital were simply abandoned as their Genoese owners fled westward. The human cost of these losses extended far beyond the immediate financial implications. Thousands of Genoese merchants, clerks, sailors, and craftsmen who had built lives in the eastern Mediterranean found themselves suddenly refugees in their own homeland. The knowledge and relationships that had supported Genoese commercial operations for centuries were dispersed as the communities that had maintained them were destroyed or scattered. Yet even as their traditional empire crumbled, individual Genoese merchants demonstrated the entrepreneurial spirit that had originally built their republic's wealth. Christopher Columbus, though working for Spanish patrons, drew on Genoese financial networks and commercial expertise in planning his Atlantic voyages. The banking techniques developed in Genoa found new applications in financing Spanish exploration and colonial development. The irony of this situation was not lost on contemporary observers. Genoese innovations in navigation, finance, and commercial organization were enabling Spanish and Portuguese expansion into Atlantic markets, but the profits from these new opportunities were flowing to Iberian rather than Italian merchants. The intellectual capital that Genoa had developed over centuries was being exploited by competitors who had learned from Genoese examples but did not share the benefits with their teachers. The Casa di San Giorgio's attempts to adapt to these changing circumstances provide fascinating insights into the challenges facing any institution trying to manage fundamental economic transformation. The bank's directors explored investments in Atlantic exploration, New World colonial development, and European manufacturing. However, these alternative opportunities required different skills and relationships than traditional Mediterranean trade, and the learning curve proved steep and expensive. The gradual shift of global commerce away from the Mediterranean fundamentally altered the competitive advantages that had made Genoa successful. The Republic's strategic location, which had been invaluable when trade routes ran from Asia through the eastern Mediterranean to Western Europe, became less relevant as Atlantic routes began carrying increasing volumes of intercontinental commerce. Geographic advantages that had seemed permanent proved to be temporary when technological and political developments changed the basic patterns of international trade. The demographic consequences of Genoa's commercial decline were severe and lasting. The city that had grown to over 100,000 inhabitants during the height of medieval prosperity began to experience steady population decline as opportunities for employment diminished. Young men who might once have sought their fortunes in Eastern Mediterranean trade began emigrating to Spain, Portugal, and other emerging commercial centers where opportunities remained available. The architectural legacy of Genoa's Golden Age provided a poignant reminder of the wealth that had once flowed through the city. The magnificent palaces constructed by merchant families during the 13th and 14th centuries stood as monuments to a prosperity that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The contrast between past achievement and present difficulties was visible throughout the city. However, the decline of Genoa was neither immediate nor complete. The financial expertise that had been developed over centuries of commercial innovation retained considerable value even as traditional trading opportunities disappeared. Genoese bankers continued to play important roles in international finance, though increasingly as service providers rather than as principals in major commercial ventures. The Casa di San Giorgio demonstrated remarkable resilience in adapting to reduced circumstances. The institution continued operations until 1805, finding new roles in managing public debt, facilitating international payments, and providing financial services that drew on centuries of accumulated expertise. While the scale of operations was much reduced from the medieval peak, the quality of service remained high enough to attract clients from throughout Europe. The gradual transformation of Genoa from a major commercial power to a regional financial center illustrates the complex ways in which economic decline can occur. Rather than experiencing sudden collapse, the Republic underwent a long process of adjustment, during which traditional sources of wealth were gradually replaced by new, though smaller, opportunities. The mathematical precision that had characterized Genoese commercial analysis enabled relatively efficient management of this difficult transition. The broader implications of Genoa's decline extended far beyond the immediate effects on the city and its inhabitants. The collapse of traditional Mediterranean trade routes forced fundamental restructuring throughout southern Europe. Cities that had prospered as intermediaries in the Asian-European trade found themselves seeking new economic foundations, while regions that had depended on Mediterranean commercial prosperity experienced prolonged economic difficulties. The rise of Atlantic commerce created opportunities for some former participants in Mediterranean trade, but the skills and relationships required for success in the new system were significantly different from those that had been valuable in the old. The transition was particularly difficult for established commercial centers like Genoa, which had developed highly specialized capabilities that were not easily transferable to new circumstances. The political consequences of economic decline were equally significant. The merchant families that had dominated Genoa during its commercial golden age found their influence diminished as their wealth decreased. Political conflicts that had once been resolved through the distribution of commercial profits became more intense as the resources available for such distribution contracted. The stable Republican government that had facilitated Genoese commercial success became increasingly difficult to maintain. Yet the decline of Genoa also contained important lessons for understanding the dynamics of economic development and technological change. The Republic's experience demonstrated that even the most successful commercial systems could become obsolete when fundamental changes occurred in transportation technology, political arrangements, or global economic patterns. The adaptability that had enabled Genoese success during the medieval period proved insufficient when the basic foundations of their commercial system were undermined. The mathematical analysis of Genoa's decline reveals the important role that sunk costs played in complicating the Republic's response to changing circumstances. The enormous investments that had been made in Eastern Mediterranean trading infrastructure could not be easily redirected toward Atlantic opportunities. The specialized knowledge that Genoese merchants had developed over centuries of Eastern Mediterranean operations had limited applicability to New World commerce. The emotional and psychological dimensions of Genoa's decline were perhaps as important as the economic factors. For generations, Genoese merchants had defined themselves as masters of global commerce, capable of succeeding in any market through superior skill and determination. The realization that external forces beyond their control could undermine even their most carefully planned operations was profoundly demoralizing for a culture that had long celebrated individual achievement and commercial success. As the 15th century drew to a close, the transformation of Genoa from a global commercial power to a regional financial center was largely complete. The city remained wealthy by contemporary standards, but its influence over international commerce had been permanently diminished. The age of Italian maritime dominance was ending, to be replaced by Spanish, Portuguese, and eventually Northern European commercial supremacy. The final irony of the Genoese story was that many of the innovations they had pioneered in banking, navigation, and commercial organization provided the foundation for their successors' achievements. The techniques developed in medieval Genoa were adapted and refined by Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants who used this knowledge to build commercial empires that dwarfed anything the Italians had achieved. In the quiet chambers of the Casa di San Giorgio, clerks continued their careful record-keeping, processing transactions that maintained the final remnants of Genoa's global financial network. But the great age of Genoese commercial adventure was over, leaving behind only memories of the remarkable risks that had once paid off so magnificently, and the painful knowledge that even the most successful systems could not survive the winds of historical change. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. If this exploration of medieval entrepreneurship has enriched your understanding of how innovation and determination can transform the world, please consider subscribing to our channel. Like this video if it provided value, and share it with others who might appreciate learning about the forgotten pioneers who helped create our modern world.